Hey Reddit, I never thought I'd be the guy sitting here, writing out my life's mess for strangers on the internet to dissect. But here I am, 5 years after my world fell apart, trying to make sense of what just happened. This isn't just any story. It's one I never imagined would take such a shocking turn. Buckle up, because this is the kind of drama that even soap operas wouldn't dare touch. 5 years ago, my marriage came crashing down in the most humiliating way possible. Her name was Emily, and for nearly a decade, she was my everything. My wife, my best friend, my partner in all things. At least, that's what I thought. We had what I believed was a perfect life. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable. We had a cozy house, a golden retriever named Max, and plans for the future that involved kids, travel, and growing old together. But all of that shattered when I found out Emily was cheating on me. And not just with anyone. It was with one of my closest friends, Todd. Yeah, the guy who stood next to me at our wedding, the guy I played golf with every other weekend, the guy who would come over to our house for dinner as if nothing was happening. It was the ultimate betrayal, and it cut deeper than I thought was humanly possible. The way I found out wasn't some grand confrontation or dramatic reveal. It was a simple mistake on her part, an errant text meant for Todd that landed in my inbox instead. I'll never forget the way my heart dropped when I read it. Can't wait to see you tonight. He won't suspect a thing. That's when my world fell apart. I confronted her that night, and she didn't even bother denying it. She just stared at me with tears in her eyes, saying something about how she felt trapped and how Todd made her feel alive again. I remember feeling like the air had been sucked out of the room. In that moment, everything we'd built together crumbled. The divorce was messy. Emily and Todd didn't last long. They never do in these kinds of situations. And me? I went through the stages of grief in the most chaotic way possible. Anger, denial, self-pity, all of it. But eventually, I found a way to move forward. I picked myself up, got a better job, and moved to a new city. I started a new life, one that didn't include her or any of the baggage she left behind. Or so I thought. Fast forward to last week. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting at my desk at work, going through emails, when my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number, but something about it felt familiar. I answered, half expecting it to be a telemarketer, but the voice on the other end stopped me cold. "Hi, it's me," she said. "Emily, my ex-wife." I hadn't heard her voice in 5 years, but I recognized it immediately. My heart started pounding, a mix of anger, anxiety, and confusion. Why was she calling me? What could she possibly want after all this time? "Why are you calling me?" I asked, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. There was a pause, and I could hear her take a deep breath. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from," she began, her voice trembling, "but I didn't know who else to call. I need your help." Help. That word hit me like a slap in the face. She had the audacity to ask for my help after what she'd done? I wanted to hang up right then and there, to tell her she had no right to ask me for anything. But curiosity got the better of me. Against my better judgment, I stayed on the line. "What do you want, Emily?" I asked, my tone colder than I intended. She hesitated again, and when she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. It's about Todd." Todd. The name alone made my stomach churn. I hadn't thought about him in years, but hearing it now brought back a flood of memories I'd worked so hard to bury. "What about him?" I asked, bracing myself for whatever nonsense she was about to unload. He's gone," she said, her voice breaking. "He disappeared." Disappeared? My mind was racing. What did that even mean? "What do you mean he disappeared?" I asked, my patience wearing thin. She let out a shaky breath. "I don't know. He just vanished. No one's seen him in weeks." And her voice broke again, and I could hear her trying to hold back tears. "I think someone might have hurt him." Hurt him? My head was spinning. Why was she telling me this? What did she expect me to do about it? "Emily, why are you calling me about this?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice calm. "I haven't spoken to either of you in years. This has nothing to do with me." "I know," she said quickly. "I know it doesn't. But I don't know who else to talk to. You know him. You know me. I just thought." Her voice trailed off, and for a moment, all I could hear was the sound of her breathing. I wanted to tell her to leave me alone, to figure out her problems on her own. But there was something in her voice, something that made me pause. She sounded scared, desperate, and as much as I hated to admit it, a part of me still cared, if only because I needed to know why she thought I could help. "Fine," I said finally, against my better judgment. "Tell me everything." And that's when the real story began. Emily's silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. I was about to ask again when she finally spoke, her voice shaky and uneven. "I know this sounds crazy, but I think Todd got himself into something dangerous," she said. "Something illegal." That word, illegal, hit me like a punch to the gut. Todd had always seemed like the slick, arrogant type who thought he could get away with anything. But illegal? I couldn't wrap my head around it. "Emily, what are you talking about? What kind of something are we even discussing here?" "I don't know exactly," she admitted, her words tumbling out quickly, like she was trying to get them out before losing her nerve. "He started acting weird a couple of months ago. He'd go out late at night, take strange calls, and he started carrying cash, lots of it. I didn't ask questions because, well, I didn't think it was my place anymore." "Not your place?" I interrupted, unable to keep the sarcasm out of my voice. "Funny, because 5 years ago, you seemed pretty comfortable making him your entire world." There was a sharp intake of breath on her end, and for a moment, I regretted saying it. But then I reminded myself that she'd earned every ounce of bitterness I could throw at her. "I deserve that," she said quietly. "I know I do. But please, just hear me out." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "Fine. Keep talking." She hesitated again, as if trying to figure out how much to tell me. "One night, he came home late, later than usual, and he looked scared. I'd never seen him like that before. He wouldn't tell me what happened, but he said something about owing people money. Dangerous people." I ran a hand through my hair, trying to process what she was telling me. "So let me get this straight," I said, my voice dripping with disbelief. "You're telling me Todd got himself mixed up with some shady characters, and now he's vanished? And you think I can help because, why?" "Because I don't know anyone else who knows him like you do," she said, her voice breaking again. "You were his friend before." "Stop." I cut her off, my anger flaring. "Don't call me his friend. Not after what the two of you did." There was a long silence, and I could hear her struggling to keep herself together. "You're right," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't have the right to ask you for anything, but I'm scared. Okay? I don't know what to do. And if something happened to him, I just need to know." I rubbed my temples, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. I wanted to tell her to figure it out herself, to hang up and never think about her or Todd again. But something about her fear felt real, and as much as I hated to admit it, I was curious. What had Todd gotten himself into? And why was Emily so desperate that she'd reach out to me, of all people? "Do you have any idea who these dangerous people are?" I asked, keeping my tone even. "No," she said quickly. "But I found something. After he disappeared, I went through his stuff, and I found this notebook. It's full of names, addresses, dollar amounts. I think it's some kind of ledger. Did you go to the police?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "I couldn't," she said, her voice trembling. "What if they think I'm involved? What if these people find out I have it?" I closed my eyes, letting out a slow breath. This was a disaster, and somehow, I'd been dragged into it. "Emily, listen to me," I said, trying to sound calm even though my heart was pounding. "If Todd got himself involved in something illegal, that's on him. It's not your responsibility to clean up his mess." "But what if they come after me?" she asked, her voice rising. "What if I'm next?" Her fear was palpable, and it sent a chill down my spine. As much as I wanted to tell her it wasn't my problem, I couldn't ignore the possibility that she might actually be in danger. I hated her for what she'd done to me, but I didn't want to see her hurt. "All right," I said reluctantly. "Where are you? I'll come by, and you can show me this notebook." She gave me her address, an apartment across town, and I hung up, already regretting my decision. What was I thinking? This was Emily, the woman who destroyed me. I had no reason to help her, no reason to get involved in whatever mess she and Todd had created. And yet, there was a part of me that couldn't walk away, a part of me that needed answers. An hour later, I found myself standing outside her apartment building. It was a modest place, nothing like the house we'd shared back when we were married. As I walked up the stairs to her door, I felt a mix of anger, anxiety, and something I couldn't quite place. Pity, maybe. She opened the door before I could knock, her face pale and drawn. She looked older than I remembered, like the past 5 years had taken their toll on her. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of something close to sympathy, but I pushed it aside. I wasn't here to comfort her. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. The apartment was small and sparsely furnished, with boxes stacked in the corners like she was getting ready to move. Or maybe she was planning to run. She led me to the kitchen table, where a worn leather notebook sat in the center. I sat down and opened it, flipping through the pages. It was exactly as she described, a ledger. Names, addresses, and dollar amounts filled the pages, written in Todd's messy handwriting. Some of the names had question marks beside them, while others were underlined. At the bottom of one page, I saw a note scrawled in the margin. "Need to pay Victor by the 15th. "Who's Victor?" I asked, looking up at her. She shook her head. "I don't know. I've never heard that name before." I flipped to another page and found more notes, dates, times, cryptic messages that didn't make much sense. But one thing was clear. Todd had been in deep with someone, and it hadn't ended well. "This isn't just some small-time debt," I said, closing the notebook. "This looks serious. Whatever he was involved in, it wasn't legal." She nodded, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What do I do?" I leaned back in my chair, trying to think. I didn't want to get involved, but I also couldn't leave her to deal with this on her own, not when it could put her in real danger. "First, you need to hide this notebook somewhere safe," I said. "If these people come looking for it, you don't want them to find it here." "And then what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, knowing the answer would only complicate things further. "And then, we figure out who Victor is. Any places he used to frequent, or people he hung out with?" Emily shook her head, looking defeated. "No, he didn't exactly share his secrets with me. He would just leave, sometimes for hours, and when I asked where he was going, he'd brush me off or get defensive." Of course he did, I thought bitterly. Todd had always been good at making people feel small, at shutting down questions he didn't want to answer. I'd seen it firsthand during the time I considered him a friend. "What about his phone?" I asked. "Do you have it?" She hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I kept it. I thought it might have clues, but it's locked." I sighed. "All right, let me see it." She disappeared into the bedroom and returned a moment later with Todd's phone. It was an older model, one I recognized because he'd always bragged about it being practically indestructible. The lock screen was a simple PIN code. "What's the code?" I asked. "I don't know," she said, frowning. "I tried all the usual ones. Birthdays, anniversaries, even random numbers he used a lot. Nothing works." Of course, Todd wouldn't make it easy. He was the kind of guy who loved having secrets, who thrived on being one step ahead of everyone else. But I wasn't about to give up. "We'll figure it out later," I said, pocketing the phone. "For now, let's focus on this Victor guy." Emily looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. "Do you really think he could be dangerous?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But if Todd owed him money, and if this guy is as shady as he sounds, then yeah, it's possible." She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she clutched her coffee mug. I could see the fear written all over her face, and despite everything, I felt a twinge of sympathy. She'd made her bed, sure, but no one deserved to be dragged into something this dark. "Here's what we'll do," I said, leaning forward. "Victor Morales wasn't just some random guy. He was a known loan shark, someone with a reputation for being ruthless. According to what little information I could find, he operated out of a small office in a seedy part of town, and his name had come up in a few police investigations over the years. This wasn't just bad. This was really bad." I called Emily that evening to fill her in. I found something, I said, skipping the pleasantries. Victor Morales is a loan shark. A dangerous one. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Oh my God, she whispered. What do we do? We don't do anything yet, I said firmly. This guy isn't someone we want to mess with. If Todd owed him money, there's a good chance he's the reason Todd disappeared. But we can't go to the police without more proof. What kind of proof? She asked, her voice. Don't answer the door unless you know who it is, and don't talk to anyone about this. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Victor Morales, about Todd's mysterious disappearance, about the danger Emily might be in. As much as I hated her for what she'd done to me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just her or Todd. There was something dark lurking beneath the surface, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. The next morning, I decided to pay a visit to Victor's office. I knew it was a risk, but I couldn't sit around doing nothing. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them by waiting for them to fall into my lap. Victor's office was exactly what I expected. A dingy building in a rundown part of town, with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. I hesitated outside the door, my heart pounding, before finally stepping inside. The receptionist, a young woman with a bored expression, barely looked up from her phone as I approached. You got an appointment? She asked, not bothering to hide her disdain. I need to see Victor, I said, trying to sound confident. She raised an eyebrow, looking me up and down. Victor doesn't see people without an appointment. Who are you? An old friend of Todd's, I said, hoping the name would get me somewhere. Her expression changed slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. Todd? Haven't seen him around in a while. Exactly, I said. That's why I'm here. I think something happened to him, and I thought Victor might know something. She frowned, leaning back in her chair. Wait here, she said, disappearing into the back. I stood there, my heart racing, wondering if I'd just made a huge mistake. Moments later, she returned, motioning for me to follow her. Victor will see you now. The office was dark and sparse, with a single desk and a few chairs. Victor Morales sat behind the desk, a large, intimidating man with sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me. He didn't look up as I entered, motioning for me to sit. So, he said, his voice low and gravelly. You're looking for Todd? I nodded, trying to keep my composure. That's right. He's been missing for weeks, and I thought you might know something. Victor leaned back in his chair, studying me. Why do you care? You his brother or something? No, I said quickly. Just an old friend. He smirked, clearly not buying it. Well, let me save you some time. Todd's problems are his own. If he's missing, it's got nothing to do with me. The way he said it didn't sit right with me. There was something in his tone, something calculated, like he was holding back. If you do know something, I said carefully, I just want to find him. That's all. Victor's expression darkened. You're asking a lot of questions for someone who doesn't belong here. I suggest you stop while you're ahead. I knew I wasn't going to get any more out of him, at least not today. So I nodded, thanked him, and left, my mind racing with possibilities. Whatever Todd had gotten himself into, it was worse than I'd imagined. And somehow, I had a feeling this was just the beginning. Walking out of Victor Morales' office felt like I had just stepped out of a lion's den. The way he had looked at me, his words dripping with thinly veiled menace, I knew I was in over my head. As much as I hated Todd and resented Emily, this was far bigger than their betrayal or my lingering bitterness. Todd wasn't just missing. He was in serious trouble. And somehow, I had to figure out what to do before this mess swallowed us all whole. That evening, I sat in my small, dimly lit apartment, replaying the conversation with Victor over and over in my head. His words had been careful, deliberate. He wasn't someone who spoke carelessly. If he had any connection to Todd's disappearance, he wasn't going to reveal it easily. But there was something about his tone, the way he dismissed Todd's situation, that told me he knew more than he let on. I pulled out Todd's phone, staring at the locked screen. There had to be something in there, something that could give me the answers I needed. Emily had said she tried all the usual codes, but I wasn't convinced she had thought it through entirely. Todd was predictable in some ways, always believing himself cleverer than he actually was. I typed in a series of numbers, his favorite football team's founding year. Nothing. His high school jersey number. Nothing. I sat back, frustrated, until I remembered something Emily had mentioned years ago when we were still married. Todd was superstitious about the number 13. It had been part of his email address back when we were friends. Taking a chance, I entered 131313. The screen unlocked. Gotcha. I muttered to myself, feeling a strange mix of triumph and unease. I had no idea what I'd find, but I was about to dive headfirst into Todd's life, secrets and all. The phone was a treasure trove of messages, photos, and notes. Most of it was mundane. Texts to colleagues, photos of nights out, reminders for bills. But then I found a series of texts that made my stomach turn. The messages were from a contact saved as V, and they were short, cryptic, and ominous. Payment due by Friday. Don't test me. We're not talking about small money anymore. You know the deal. If you miss another deadline, I'm coming to collect. The timestamps on the messages lined up with what Emily had told me about Todd's behavior. The late nights, the stress, the fear in his eyes. V had to be Victor Morales, and these texts made it clear Todd owed him more than just pocket change. But how much? And what had Todd promised in return? I scrolled further, finding more messages between Todd and an unknown number. These were even more troubling. Got the shipment? Where should I drop it off? The cops are sniffing around. Be careful. I don't care what they said. I'm not taking the fall for this. Shipment? Cops? What the hell had Todd gotten himself into? This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about something illegal. Drugs? Weapons? Something worse? My mind was racing, and the pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. Todd hadn't just been borrowing money from Victor. He'd been running something for him. And now he was either in hiding or worse, gone for good. The next morning, I called Emily. She answered on the second ring, her voice shaky. Did you find anything? Whatever it wasn't legal. And it explains why he was so paranoid before he disappeared. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Emily spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you think Victor did something to him? I don't know, I admitted. But if Todd owed him money and wasn't delivering, it's definitely a possibility. What do we do now? She asked, her fear palpable. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. We need to find out exactly how much Todd owed and what he was moving. The more we know, the better chance we have of figuring out what happened to him. And how do we do that? She asked, desperation creeping into her voice. I'll handle it, I said firmly. You just need to stay safe and keep a low profile. If anyone asks about Todd, play dumb. Don't mention the notebook, don't mention me, and definitely don't mention Victor. She agreed, but as I sat there, staring at Todd's phone and the cryptic messages from Victor, I realized I couldn't do this alone. I needed someone who knew the world Todd had gotten himself into. Someone who could help me navigate it without getting myself killed. That evening, I called an old friend. His name was Jake, and he'd been a cop for nearly a decade before leaving the force to start his own private investigation business. Jake and I had lost touch over the years, but I knew he was the kind of guy who could help me figure this out. Long time no talk, Jake said when he answered, his voice warm but curious. What's going on? It's a long story, I said, trying to keep my tone light. But I've got a bit of a situation, and I could use your expertise. What kind of situation? He asked, his tone shifting to one of concern. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Let's just say someone I used to know got mixed up with some dangerous people, and now they're missing. I've got a phone full of cryptic messages and a notebook with some names and addresses. I need to figure out what it all means. Jake was silent for a moment, and I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. All right, he said finally. Bring me what you've got, and I'll see what I can do. But if this involves anything illegal, you need to be careful. People in that world don't take kindly to outsiders asking questions. Trust me, I said. I'm already well aware of that. The guy was rough-looking, with tattoos snaking up his neck and a permanent scowl etched on his face. What do you want? He asked, his voice low and hostile. We're looking for someone, Jake said smoothly. Todd. He's been missing for a while, and we heard he might have been around here. The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought he was going to slam the door in our faces. But instead, he stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Don't know no Todd, he said, crossing his arms. And you shouldn't be asking questions around here. Jake didn't flinch. We're not looking to cause trouble. We just want to find out what happened to him. Instead, he flipped through the notebook, his finger tracing the names and addresses. Finally, he stopped on one name, Carlos Alvarez. This guy, Jake said, tapping the page. He's been mentioned multiple times, and he's the only one with a phone number listed. If anyone knows what happened to Todd, it's him. I stared at the name, feeling a mix of hope and dread. Do you think he'll talk? Jake shrugged. There's only one way to find out. The next day, we called the number listed for Carlos Alvarez. To my surprise, he picked up on the first ring. His voice was gruff, impatient, like he didn't have time for nonsense. Who is this? He demanded. Jake took the lead, his tone calm and professional. We're looking for information about Todd. We know you've worked with him, and we need to know where he is. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and I held my breath, waiting for Carlos to respond. In the back corner of the room, a man sat alone in a booth. He had sharp features, a leather jacket draped over his broad shoulders, and a cigarette dangling from his lips. Even without an introduction, I knew it was Carlos. Jake led the way, sliding into the booth across from him. I followed, keeping my expression neutral. Carlos looked us over, his dark eyes sharp and calculating. You the ones looking for Todd? He asked, exhaling a puff of smoke. We are, Jake said evenly. We heard you might know something. Carlos smirked, tapping the ash from his cigarette into a chipped ceramic ashtray. I know a lot of things. But like I said, information isn't free. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope of cash, sliding it across the table. This should cover it, he said. Now start talking. Carlos picked up the envelope, thumbing through the bills with a look of approval. There were no lights on, no sign of life. But Jake wasn't taking any chances. He parked the car a short distance away, cutting the engine and motioning for me to stay quiet. We approached the cabin cautiously, our footsteps crunching on the gravel. Jake had his hand on his holster, ready for anything. When we reached the front door, he knocked loudly, the sound echoing in the stillness. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, we heard movement inside. Footsteps, hesitant and shuffling. The door creaked open a few inches, and a face appeared in the gap. It was Todd. He looked like a man on the edge. His eyes sunken, his hair disheveled, and his face pale and gaunt. When he saw me, his expression shifted from fear to disbelief. What the hell are you doing here? He hissed, glancing nervously over his shoulder. We need to talk, Jake said, his tone firm. Let us in. Todd hesitated, but eventually opened. Do you think what's in that case will be enough to stop Victor? Jake glanced at me, his jaw tight. It's a start, he said, his voice low. But it's dangerous. If Victor finds out this case exists, or that we have it, we're all dead. Dead. The word hung in the air between us like a ghost. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my thoughts racing. This wasn't just about Todd anymore. Emily was in danger, I was in danger, and even Jake, who had no personal stake in this, had put himself in harm's way. What's the plan? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Jake opened the case, revealing neatly organized folders, USB drives, and a ledger similar to the one we'd found earlier. I hadn't spoken to anyone but Jake and Emily. The realization hit me like a freight train. Victor had eyes everywhere. And now, those eyes were on me. The next morning, I called Jake. We've got a problem, I said, my voice tight. Victor knows. There was a pause on the other end of the line before Jake responded. How do you know? He left a note in my apartment, I said, my grip tightening on the phone. He's watching me, Jake. And if he knows I'm involved, he probably knows about you and Emily, too. Jake cursed under his breath. All right, he said, his tone sharp. We need to move fast. I went through the case last night, and there's enough in here to bury Victor if we get it to the right people. But we can't do it alone. I'm calling in a contact, someone I trust. Meet me at my office in an hour. When I arrived at Jake's office, I found him sitting at his desk, a manila folder spread open in front of him. Beside him was a woman I didn't recognize, sharp-eyed, with an air of authority that immediately put me on edge. "This is Agent Harper," Jake said, gesturing to her. "FBI. She's one of the few people I trust with this." Agent Harper stood and extended a hand. "I've been investigating Victor Morales for years," she said, "but we've never had enough to take him down. If what Jake says is true, this case might be the break we've been waiting for." I shook her hand, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time in days. "What do we need to do?" I asked. "We need to protect the evidence," she said. "Victor has people everywhere, and if he gets wind that we're building a case against him, he'll destroy everything and everyone in his path. That means you, Jake, Todd, and Emily are all targets." I swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. "So what's the plan?" "We're moving the evidence to a secure location," she said, "and we're putting you and Emily under protection until this is over." "And Todd?" I asked. Her expression darkened. "If Todd wants our help, he needs to come in. Otherwise, he's on his own." The next few days were a blur of activity. Agent Harper and her team worked quickly, transferring the evidence to a secure location while Jake and I focused on keeping Emily safe. I moved her to a hotel under a fake name, making sure no one could trace her location. She was terrified, but she trusted me enough to follow my lead. But even with all our precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I left the hotel, I felt eyes on me. Jake and Agent Harper worked tirelessly, combing through every lead, every name in Todd's notebook, every contact he might have reached out to. Meanwhile, Emily remained in hiding, her fear palpable every time I checked in on her. The tension was suffocating, and the longer Todd stayed missing, the more I feared the worst. Finally, after days of searching, Jake called me. His voice was sharp, urgent. "We've got him. Todd just surfaced at a motel on the outskirts of town. Harper's sending a team, but we need to get there now. If Victor's men are on his trail, we're out of time." I didn't hesitate. Within minutes, I was in Jake's car, speeding toward the motel. The sun was setting, casting the sky in hues of orange and red, as if the world itself was bracing for the storm about to unfold. When we arrived, the motel was eerily quiet. A single flickering neon sign buzzed in the evening air, and most of the rooms were dark. Harper's team was already there, dressed in plain clothes, but armed and ready. They motioned for us to follow, their faces grim. Todd's room was at the far end of the lot. As we approached, my heart pounded in my chest. This was it. We were either going to save him or walk straight into a trap. Jake knocked on the door, his voice steady but firm. "Todd, it's us. Open up." For a moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, the door creaked open. Todd stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes sunken. He looked worse than when we'd seen him at the cabin, like he hadn't slept or eaten in days. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, glancing nervously down the hallway. "You shouldn't have come." "Neither should you," Jake shot back, pushing past him into the room. "Do you have any idea how close you are to getting yourself killed?" Todd slumped into a chair, his hands trembling. "I didn't know what else to do," he admitted. "I thought if I ran far enough." "You can't outrun Victor," Jake said bluntly. "The only way you get out of this alive is if you cooperate with us and Harper's team. You have to testify, give them everything they need to take him down." Todd's eyes darted between Jake, Harper, and me. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and Harper assured us that he wouldn't be seeing the outside of a prison cell for a very long time. But even with Victor behind bars, the scars he'd left behind remained. Todd was placed in witness protection, his life forever changed. Emily, though safe for now, was a shell of the person she'd once been. As for me, I tried to move forward, but the events of the past few months had left a mark I couldn't erase. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Emily. "Thank you for everything." I stared at the screen for a long time, my emotions a tangled mess. Part of me wanted to hate her, to blame her for dragging me into this nightmare. But another part of me knew that without her call, Todd would have been dead, and Victor's operation would still be running unchecked. In the end, I replied with a simple message: take care of yourself. And with that, I finally closed the chapter on the most harrowing experience of my life. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. I was done looking back. It was time to rebuild, to focus on myself, and to leave the past where it belonged, behind me.